Hello, this is the Demonic Tutor with part 2 of a two-part series on how to draft Star Wars Unlimited, specifically the first set, Spark of the Rebellion. Now, if you have not watched part 1, I suggest you watch it. I will have the link in the video description. But if you have already watched it, we will be doing a quick recap of part 1. So the main points from part 1 are: number 1 is during the first part of the draft, called the leader draft, you will want to draft at least one heroism and one villainy leader into your stable of leaders. Then when you move on to phase 2 of the draft, the playables draft, around pick 4 of pack 1, be on the lookout for the open lanes. Of course, those are the aspects that you expect that the other drafters are not drafting, which means that you are likely to be picking the best cards from that aspect. And lastly, as you draft, be conscious of your deck's curve. All right, that is the ratio of the costs of the cards that you have in your deck. You want to ensure that your deck has enough early plays to survive the opening. Now, moving on to part 2, we're going to go a little bit more deeply into deck construction and how that affects evaluating cards as we draft. It's important to note that a good draft pick is contextual. That implies that a card that's great to pick pack 1, pick 1 might not be great to pick pack 3, pick 1. And that's because as you draft more cards, your deck is going to fit one of 3 categories. You'll either be an aggro deck, a mid-range deck, or a control deck. And so understanding what type of deck you are building will help you better evaluate which cards will fit better in your deck. So to go back to that point, if you are drafting an aggro deck, then pack 3, pick 1, there might be a great control card, but you won't be able to draft it. Whereas if it was pack 1, pick 1, and you had a really good control card before your deck was established, you might want to pick up a really great control card, pack 1, pick 1. Okay. And so trying to understand the 4 possible board states or quadrants of a Star Wars Unlimited match will be critical to properly evaluating cards, understanding the deck type that you are trying to create, etc. So what is a board state and what is a quadrant? Well, this idea came from a concept in Magic known as quadrant theory. And it was introduced and popularized by Brian Wong and Marshall Sutcliffe of the podcast Limited Resources. They're a very popular podcast if you want to learn how to draft in Magic the Gathering. And Marshall Sutcliffe identifies the 4 quadrants. He introduces in an article that I will link in the video description below. And these 4 quadrants are the 4 different board states that a card game can take. Now, in Star Wars Unlimited, the board state consists of all the cards that are in play. That includes the bases and their health, all the units in both arenas, the states of the leaders, including if they've used up their epic action or not, if the bases have used up their epic action, etc. Okay. So Marshall identifies the 4 quadrants or board states as the opening, which of course is also known as the early game, parity, a losing state or a losing board, and a winning state and a winning board. So let's go a little bit deeper into each of these quadrants, starting with the opening. So what characterizes the opening? Well, it's a time in the game when each player has 2 to 4 resources on the board, and during this time, we just start seeing units start to populate the board. You know, your Battlefield Marines, your Sabine Wrens, your Crafty Smugglers, your Greedos, etc. The leaders have not deployed. And the cards that usually perform well in the opening are cheap, right? That will cost 1 to 3 resources. they're usually units, not always units, and their job essentially is to start off the deck strategy. So either the units can push damage early, or eliminate early threats, or ramp, or otherwise set up the strategy of your deck for future turns. Now, when we get into Quadrant 2, we're talking about parity, and this is the time when the board state is relatively even. Both players have relatively equivalent units, relatively the same, they're battling for arena control, the health of the bases are relatively similar. Another way to think about parity is that if the units on the board remain the same, that is, the units are attacking into base, but no other units get played, no other events get played, who would determine the winner? It would basically be whoever races the best, all right? Whoever plays best with the units and the actions that can be taken on the board itself. I won't go too deeply into parity, simply because, at least in Star Wars Unlimited, the board state rarely stays in parity for very long. It's just the nature of the game, because damage is persistent, units are constantly attacking bases and other units. So there's hardly ever kind of like any pauses in the game, unlike Magic, where sometimes you go 2, 3, 4 turns just trying to top deck. So we won't talk too much here about parity, but it is important to note that it is a quadrant, and there are moments, at least brief moments, when a Star Wars game does go into parity. Okay. Quadrant 3 is a losing board, right? And we define a losing board by one where you see that you are more likely to incur lethal damage before your opponent does. Okay? You can tell this because your opponent has superior units on the board. The health of their base is higher. They have more resources to play cards, etc. Now, cards that perform well in a losing state will either neutralize a big threat, right? So either it'll be a removal card, or it's a card that exhausts another unit. It could be a card that blocks an opponent's attacks, so a unit that has Sentinel to prevent damage on your base. Or it's a card that can heal enough, so for example, a unit with Restore, that will help your base get out of lethal range, so you can extend the game. Okay. Now lastly, Quadrant 4 is a winning board, and of course, winning board is the opposite. Winning board is where you look at the board state and you see that your opponent is more likely to incur lethal damage before you, okay? And that's because you have superior units on the board. You have the health advantage to your base, the resource advantage, etc. Now you're probably wondering, well, if you're in a winning board, then why do you worry about cards that do well in a winning board? And while it's true that you can play almost any card in a winning board and win the game, there are certain cards that perform better, right? Cards that perform well on a winning board will be able to bypass the opponent's defenses, right? To be able to push damage, lethal damage quickly. So for example, a unit with Saboteur that can get past Sentinels. A card that has Overwhelm, so that you can push extra damage after you defeat a unit. Cards that have pumps with attack bonuses. So those are cards that perform well on a winning board. Cards that push damage that the opponent will have a really hard time preventing. So how do we use quadrant theory to help evaluate cards? Well, we can now evaluate cards and each draft pick based on how each card performs in each quadrant. It's not enough to just give a card a static grade and say this card's an A and this card's a B, so therefore we should always pick grade A cards over grade B cards. And that's because certain cards will be grade A in the opening versus other cards will be grade A in losing states. And so it's important that when we're constructing our deck that we have a balance of cards that perform well in each quadrant, right? We want to have answers for whichever board state we're facing, because over the course of the draft, we are likely to be dealing with all of these quadrants. We'll be playing within all of these quadrants. So we're going to want answers for each of these quadrants. Okay. So as an example, let's go ahead and evaluate the most expensive and likely the most valuable regular card in the entire set, Darth Vader. Right, a 7 cost, green, villainy aspect, 5/7, can ambush, and when played, search the top 10 cards of your deck for any number of villainy units with a combined cost of 3 or less and play each of them for free. Okay. Clearly, there are a lot of really good stats. It has ambush, and it can help play other cards on the board. So just to get it out of the way, in the parity state, we can imagine that Darth Vader is probably one of the best cards that you can play. So we give that an S grade. Now, in a losing state, I would also give Darth Vader an S grade. You can use its ambush to eliminate a really big threat. You can also use Darth Vader's when played ability to get maybe another defensive unit, say unit with Sentinel. Maybe you get a unit that has Restore. It really helps level the playing field and even push the board state from a losing state to parity, or even a winning state. I would also say that Darth Vader is S tier when it comes to a winning state, right? It's a really big unit. It can eliminate any chance the opponent has of getting back to parity. You can pull a unit that can push extra damage. It's just an excellent card in a winning state. Helps you go over the top. Of course, there is one quadrant where Darth Vader fails entirely, and that's the opening. And that's simply because Vader costs 7 resources. There's no way that you'll be able to play Darth Vader in the opening at all. So you would rather not see Darth Vader in your opening hand. You would hopefully rather draw into Darth Vader as you get closer to being able to play him. Versus, say, a common, like Fleet Lieutenant, right? A 3 heroism, 3/3, when played, you may attack with a unit. If it's a rebel unit, it gets +2/+0 for this attack. Clearly, a less expensive card, not as powerful or as game-changing or game-breaking as a Darth Vader. But when we look at Fleet Lieutenant from all the 4 quadrants, we see that it's a well-rounded card. In the opening, I'd probably say there are very few cards that you would want more than a Fleet Lieutenant. You're probably playing something on a 2 resource cost unit on turn 1. You come turn 2, you play Fleet Lieutenant, you can immediately attack with that unit without wasting an action. And if it's a rebel, it'll get a bonus, so even better, which will allow you to do things like take the initiative early. So Fleet Lieutenant is an excellent opening card. Now, in parity, not quite so good, but still really solid, right? You get another unit on the board, and again, when you are able to attack with a unit, it saves you an action. If you can get the +2 on it, you can push extra damage. It gives you the option of trading for a much higher card. So parity, while you might need to think about like what other cards might be on the board, or what other units that are on the board, Fleet Lieutenant would be a solid card to have in hand. Now, in a losing state, I would probably rate it a B. Again, if you have another rebel unit on the board, you can play Fleet Lieutenant and use that unit to trade up for a much bigger threat, and maybe that Fleet Lieutenant brings you back to parity. Okay. Again, it's a little bit contextual because if you don't have another rebel unit, Fleet Lieutenant will definitely won't be as useful for you. But in a losing state, it's not a bad card at all. So I would rate it as a B, And then in a winning state, I would go back to S tier. The fact that it allows you, again, to attack, and again, gives you a little bit of a bonus. It's a really great way of being able to push damage, right? So when it comes to deck construction, how do these 2 examples help us understand what cards we should be drafting? Well, we have to remember that good draft decks have cards that, on the aggregate, perform well in all 4 quadrants, we're not going to find, not all cards are going to perform well in all 4 quadrants like a Fleet Lieutenant, but we do want some cards that do well in the opening, some cards that do well in parity, some cards that do well in a losing board, some cards that do well in a winning board. Okay? A deck of 30 Fleet Lieutenants will beat a deck of 30 Darth Vaders, right? Because while you might have 4 Darth Vaders in your opening hand, you won't be able to play any of them. So you'll just be taking initiative, doing nothing on the board. Whereas if you're facing a deck with 30 Fleet Lieutenants, those Fleet Lieutenants will be attacking and synergizing with each other by giving each other bonuses. And so the Fleet Lieutenant deck should be able to defeat a Darth Vader deck before any of those Darth Vaders get a chance to go on the board, right? So what does that say about a card like Darth Vader, right? Other than drafting it for purely monetary value, in order to realize the full value of Darth Vader in a draft deck, your deck are going to need cards that will help you survive that opening, right? Because you need to get out of that opening, survive that opening, in order to have Darth Vader be able to be played to its full potential. So what kind of cards are you going to want to make sure that you're able to play Darth Vader? Well, you're going to want Sentinels. A Sentinel like a Cell Block Guard, which happens to also have Villainy, right? Again, it will block the opponent's attacks, help you survive long enough to be able to play a Darth Vader with 7 resources. You'll also want removal. Cards like Force Choke. Get rid of early threats. Keep your, base health up. You're going to want cards with Store. Cards like Consortium Star Viper, a green card, and hopefully you'll be able to take initiative. And that extra 2 Restore will hopefully keep you alive long enough to play a Darth Vader. Also, you want cards with Ambush. Again, cards with Ambush that can act like removal. I mentioned a card like Escort Skiff, which, although it has conditional ambush, because it requires you to have another green unit, if you are playing a Darth Vader, chances are you're going to be playing green as an aspect. And so if you get some cheap green units, it's more often than not, Escort Skiff will have an ambush. And so to be able to, again, get rid of an early threat, an early aggro threat, will buy you enough time for Darth Vader to be able to take over the game. So, that said, if you were playing a Darth Vader, you kind of already have a sense of what kind of deck type you're going to play, right? Now let's keep in mind, all decks want to convert the opening to a winning board state, to a definitive win. Okay? That goes without saying. However, different deck types will do this at different speeds. Okay? So, what are the different speeds? Well, we've talked about it in an earlier slide, but the first type of deck we're going to deal with is aggro. This is the fastest deck that wants to go from opening to winning state to winning. Aggro decks want to push damage early, before the opponent can respond. Good aggro openers are cheap, but they also have high power, and they can get past opponent's defenses. And so keywords you want on these units include Raid and Saboteur. Raid, of course, gives attack bonuses when attacking. Well, duh. And Saboteur can get past Sentinels. Aggro decks typically have a low curve. They have cheap cards. Most cards are going to cost 1 to 3 resources. And the cards will rarely cost more than 5 resources, because aggro decks want to finish the game early. Now, an ideal progression for a game that an aggro deck is playing, they will play the opening from turns 1 to 3. They should be in a winning board state by turns 4 and 5, and hopefully secure the win by turn 6. And so cards that kind of exemplify the aggro deck include leaders like Sabine, Ren, and IG-88. These are leaders that can flip really early, and their abilities are all about pushing extra damage. A card like Rogue Operative, it's a 2/4, but attacks as a 4/4 because it's raid 2, and it has Saboteur. Also look at a card like Fifth Brother. The fact that it can get raid for damage that is on itself, and the on attack ability can pile on damage for itself, powering itself up, making it a really big aggro threat. Also look at a card like a Partisan Insurgent. It's a 1/4, but when it's with another red unit, because red's the color of aggression, it attacks as a 3/4. And also a card like Surprise Strike, which is a buff that can, again, push extra damage. Okay, so that's an aggro deck. The opposite of an aggro deck is a control deck. And a control deck looks to maintain parity before controlling with a winning board using the most expensive, powerful units in the set. Okay, so this is the type of deck that a Darth Vader would play in because it's so expensive. Okay, now good control openers, again, opening units, will also have cards with high power. But instead of pushing damage, control decks are looking to trade because control decks know that they have the best units in the game. They just need to survive long enough to play those units. So those control openers are going to just try to eliminate the opponent's units, making sure that the opponent can't get into a winning board state and really just lengthen the game until the control deck can be assured that the biggest units will take over the board. Okay, now in the mid game, control decks are going to look to play cards with Sentinel, cards with base healing, and removal. Again, the whole name of the game is to keep the base health high enough so that the game can extend for these really big finishers like a Darth Vader. Okay, top end units, like I said, are also expensive with the largest stats in the game. Okay, an ideal progression for a control deck would be opening from turns 1 to 3, parity from turns 4 to 7. Then once the control deck gets to 8, 9, 10 resources, they should be able to get to a winning board state and then win after turn 10. So what kind of cards do we expect to see in a control deck? Well, we would expect really expensive leaders, something like a Chewbacca, which doesn't flip until resource turn 7. I'd also look at the blue villainy leader, Director Krennic. It flips at 5, but you see that the Restore 2 really suggests that a deck of this type is looking to lengthen the game as opposed to finishing the game off early. Although, mind you, the buff that Krennic gives damaged units does mean that you can play Krennic a little bit more aggressively. But generally, I would consider Krennic a control-type leader. Also, a big gigantic unit like a Blizzard Assault AT-AT, an 8 green villainy 9/9. It can also deal excess damage to other units, really making sure that stomps out any possible threat that the opponent has of finishing off a winning board state. I'd also look at a card like Homestead Militia. Now, this is a 3/4 and it has conditional Sentinel. That said, if the early game of a control deck is constructed properly, you are more often than not going to be able to get to those 6 resources, and that militia will be able to block any attempts for the opponent to push out big damage. And the fact that it has a 4 toughness means that oftentimes it will survive initial attacks from opening units. Also look at a card like a Reinforcement Walker. Again, an 8 cost. However, without the villainy aspect means you can also play this in heroism decks. It's a 6/9, so not quite as powerful as a Blizzard Assault, but it does heal. And it allows you to draw cards, which can help you draw into other units that will help you finish off the game. I'd also look at a card like Entrenched. I think Entrenched is a really good opening card here. You can use it to play on your opponent's leader if you want to kind of prevent that leader from pushing damage. You can also put it on your own Sentinels and just buff up those Sentinels and make it much harder for the opponent to attack into your base without losing a lot more units. The last deck type we'll talk about is mid-range, and the reason why we're saving this deck type for last is that it's the most ambiguous of the two types, right? If aggro is fast and control wants to lengthen the game is very slow, mid-range of course is in the middle, and so it can run a spectrum from aggro-y mid-range to control mid-range. Essentially what mid-range decks do, they try to outvalue aggro decks and out-aggro control decks. They're generally going to have cards that are balanced across all of the 4 quadrants. They will curve out usually at 6 cost resource cards. And the ideal mid-range quadrant progression is for parity, unlike the control decks, which look to stretch parity to 3, 4, 5 turns, they're really only looking to keep parity within about 4 or 5 turns, and then winning by turn 6 and 7, and hopefully secure the win by turn 8. Now, mid-range examples, again, because they're very ambiguous, it's really difficult to kind of really say this is a mid-rangey card. But generally, I think the mid-range cards are probably the most flexible. These are the cards that you could see both in aggro or in control. So I like to look at both Grand Moff Tarkin and Boba Fett as kind of like these great all-around type cards. You could play them aggressively, you could play them in control, which is why I think they're really well balanced for mid-range, because both of their abilities are suited, are really solid abilities that work in the early game, mid-game, and end game, right? They basically have value in all different types of quadrants. Okay. I'd also look at a card like Chewbacca. It is a 3/6 Sentinel, so it's not exactly aggressive. However, because when Chewbacca gets attacked, you can ready him, he can also be aggressive as well. I also like a card like Bosk, a 4/5 Ambusher, that can help clear the board with its ability to do 2 damage to a unit every time you play an event. I also like ATST here. It's a 6 cost, it's a 6/7 Overwhelm, and so this is a really nice top end to push that extra damage over aggro decks, and hopefully can outrace control decks. I'd also look at kind of like Baze Malbus. This is definitely kind of like one of those tweener cards, which only has Sentinel when you have the initiative. So if you're a control deck, you're probably going to have initiative more often. But because it has a grit, it also has the option of being more aggressive in order to be able to push extra damage to hopefully finish off a game sooner than a control deck and hopefully beat up on aggro decks. Now, how will knowing aggro, control, and mid-range help you in your draft? Well, cards that fit in multiple deck types, and you'll know these because they'll perform well in multiple quadrants, and they'll have only one aspect. Well, these cards are going to be in much higher demand. A lot more players are going to want these cards, and so you're going to want to try to select these cards early. So in picks like 2 through 4 in the packs, obviously pack 1 you might get a chance to see a rare or legendary, and maybe you're going to pick that. But really in picks 2 and 4, when we feel the rares and legendaries off the board, you're going to want to pick up these really popular cards. Cards like Fleet Lieutenant, we mentioned. Really like Viper Probe Droid. It's a 3/2, so therefore it can attack well, it can trade well. Being able to know the opponent's hand will allow you to play around certain cards. Or Consortium Star Viper, right? It's a 3/3, but it also has Restore, so it can help you keep you alive, but it can also be played aggressively if you wanted to. And all of these cards, of course, are one aspect, which makes them very flexible. It's also important to note that while decks ideally would fit into these nice aggro mid-range control categories, many drafts are going to force you to combine styles. Or in other words, you're going to have a lot of flavors of mid-range because you're going to have some mix of aggro and control. And that's because the lanes that are open might cause you to select cards that seemingly conflict. So for example, a few drafts ago, I drafted a Chewbacca red-blue aggro control. Chewbacca ended up being my only heroism leader, and I noticed in the first couple of packs I saw Fighters for Freedom. So, this is one of the best uncommons in the game. So I decided to select it. And so I got Partisan Insurgent. Thinking, though, that I believe I had like an IG-88. But I was thinking that with Partisan Insurgent that maybe I could get away from heroism, maybe play one of my villainy leaders. Maybe I could play an aggressive deck that way. But then, late in Pack 1, I got a Cargo Juggernaut. It fits the color with Chewbacca. It is one of the better control cards because it provides healing. So I decided to pick it up. Well, it turns out in Pack 2, I believe around pick 4, I got past an Obi-Wan Kenobi. And I thought, oh my god. 3 picks in, and here comes this Obi-Wan here. It's one of the best control cards in the game, and it was heroism. I couldn't see myself passing that up. Because, what card was going to be better than Obi-Wan Kenobi? What card was going to have a higher upside? So I decided I was going to commit to Obi-Wan Kenobi, and I would try to play this aggro control deck. And in Pack 3, I think my pick 1 ended up being a Redemption, which further pushed me to control. So while I did have control cards, my early game was going to be to try to push damage early, right? And if need be, I could try to trade. And it turns out that the Sentinels that I had out here, Obi-Wan Kenobi, don't forget Redemption is a Sentinel, when Chewbacca flipped, they turned out to be really great protectors of my aggressive units. Because the Sentinels would, those are the cards that the opponent would have to target their attacks on, while my aggressive units can continually do damage to the base. So it ended up being a really great draft deck. Ultimately, synergies will emerge when you play the best cards at their respective costs. And so if you pay attention to drafting those open lanes, you can get a deck like a red-blue aggro control. Okay? So while it's important to know these synergies, to know these deck types, if you draft the best cards, the synergies are just going to come up. Okay. So what have we learned, or at least what do I hope that you have learned from this video? Number 1, when drafting, you want to consider how each card performs in the 4 main board states, or quadrants: opening, parity, losing state, and the winning state. Aggro decks are going to look to draft cards that both deal damage quickly and have Saboteur to bypass Sentinels. These decks are going to want cheap cards that perform well in the opening and winning states. Control decks are going to look to extend the game using Sentinels, removal cards, and healing. These cards are going to want to perform well in parity or losing states, along with large units that can convert parity and losing states to winning states. And of course, mid-range is looking for a balance between these two. Okay? Certain cards that will excel in all 4 quadrants and can fit in multiple deck types will be highly sought after in draft, so try to pick up these cards early in the pack, picks 2 and 4, and hope that cards that you want but are more narrow in scope will come back to you on the wheel. So for example, if you are drafting a control deck, and you have a choice between a Consortium Star Viper and a Blizzard AT-AT, pick the Consortium Star Viper first, because fewer decks will be able to play that Blizzard AT-AT. So get the Consortium Star Viper, get that early card, and then hopefully everyone else are going to draft cards that more fit their deck, and that Blizzard AT-AT will hopefully come around on the wheel, and you'll be able to pick up both of those cards as opposed to only picking up one of them. Okay? So thank you so much for watching this video. I do expect to put up some supplemental videos as new sets come out, so we can maybe use quadrant theory to evaluate some of these cards as kind of the new draft formats come up. But if you like what you saw, of course, please subscribe to the channel. Please comment, because I'm always looking for feedback and advice to make these videos more effective, more educational. And if you disagree with any of the points, let's be part of the conversation. So anyways, again, thanks again for watching, and may the Force be with you. Take care.